So this week, as I've mentioned in the mini lesson, we're going to be talking about followership, and we're going to be talking about organizational analysis and organizational development, basically what the structures of organizations are like, different kinds of theorists who have talked about organizations and developed thinking about organizations. So we've been talking a lot about leadership, and I think it's important to think about leadership and followership together. So looking at organizations as a way to understand how leadership needs to adapt to the followership that it has. So remember from our work the first week that organizations are goal-driven. They exist for a purpose, and that's really what gathers people around a particular mission, around a particular goal. Hence the importance of mission, vision, and values. Those help us define those goals for the organization as leaders and describe ways to achieve them. Mission, vision, values are central to any organization. They exist at the core. And they also exert some influence on whether or not they're achieved in and of themselves if people believe in that mission, vision, and values. But there are also in these concentric circles some other elements of organizations that can affect those mission, vision, and values. First of all, there are the strategies of groups, strategies of individuals and subsystems like teams, informal connections that can affect outcomes. On the very outside circle are critical elements to really think about as leaders, however, and we're seeing that this week as we read Edgar Schein. There's the environment, the physical environment in which people work in the organization, and there's also the organizational culture, which is ultimately the shared assumptions that people have about an organization built up over time. The various systems within an organization are what make that organization dynamic. It's always moving, it's always changing. Teams, groups, levels, divisions, departments, each take input, processes that are developed largely through collaborative action. So creating outcomes that engender feedback from the inside and the outside of the system. Inside, it's important to think about integration of the various group systems and individuals. And on the outside, we're thinking about threats and different forces that can affect that organization. So creating feedback both at the inside level and at the outside level can also affect an organization's behavior and health. Systems operate in similar ways, and it's important that systems seek balance, especially when change or any threat from outside upsets that balance. They need to be responsive, so creating that feedback loop where actions engender results, those results are observed and analyzed, and those events in this definition require further action so that organizations can be successful and maintain some health. In thinking about organizations, it's important to remember some of these concepts because they can dictate the success or failure of any organization. And when I talk about organizations, I'm talking also about teams that you might be leading as literacy specialists in schools. So important questions to ask around these concepts are, is there authority and who has the authority? Does the leader, does the team have the capacity, or has it been given the responsibility and the authority to actually make a decision about a particular program or whatever the team is working on? To whom is the team or the organization accountable? So leadership structure and responsibility can really affect and influence outcomes if, for example, no authority is delegated. Here are four basic structures of organizations. The centralized organization you might be familiar with, where there's strong authority, command, and control. New York State Education Department might be an example of this kind of centralized authority. The advantages are that there's uniformity and consistency and a predictable internal environment. The disadvantages are that this particular model limits responsiveness and also limits the members' creativity and therefore their morale. Decentralized organizations are what they sound like, and in some sense, Ed Vikes' article on schools bore out this idea of decentralized organizations. They're typically smaller autonomous units that have decision-making authority, like classrooms. They're highly responsible to external environmental changes. Their disadvantages are, and so many of you wrote about this and talked about it, is that they're more difficult to control and coordinate. Product service line kinds of structures really focus on a single product or a single service, and there's throughput from one end to another end. In other words, that's what they're focused on, and they focus on the development of products and services through jobs and job descriptions that are fixed. The advantages are there are priorities, and accountability can be clearly set. So on an assembly line, you have a job, for example, and you know that you're accountable for doing that job. The disadvantages, on the other hand, are that there's a focus on products and not necessarily values. So sometimes the quality of the product can suffer because the product line continues to move when the value of quality is diminished. Matrix is shared authority and shared responsibility. So it's a very flat kind of structure for an organization. And this might be a group of volunteers, or it might be, for example, a political party in a particular county where a lot of different members have input. How work is organized has been a focus since the 19th century for various thinkers, trying to analyze exactly how organizations function. So organizational theory, organizational psychology developed out of this particular discipline. And organizational theory aims to define and describe organizations largely in terms of followership and leadership. Karl Marx is the granddaddy of organizational analysis and organizational theory. So in looking at organizations, he saw organizations as being restless, as being in conflict, and the conflict was taking place between members, followers in the organization, workers in the organization, and leadership. So he saw all this as very dynamic and constantly moving. So he called for more authority for workers authority over systems and systems processes, in a sense flattening that organization out, much like that matrix model that we just took a look at, flattening the hierarchy so that members and followers could share resources, share authority, share responsibility, and ultimately share the fruits and outcomes of their labors. So a couple of decades later in the 19th century, Emile Durkheim looked at organizations and recognized that there were different roles within organizations and different roles within groups that people had to perform, different tasks, and they're rewarded specifically for those kinds of contributions. He also introduced the idea of cooperation among all these different groups and different followers, and provided a blueprint for thinking about how to manage that hierarchy that existed in organizations, leaders over followers. Toward the end of the 19th century, Max Weber speculated on the idea of bureaucracy, and this is something we've heard of before. So he posited the fact that in larger organizations, there is command and control that's exercised from above, largely through written documentation and memos. That's how bureaucracies communicate with one another. If you think of the United States government, you've got an idea of a large bureaucracy that sort of fulfills Max Weber's definitions. So building that hierarchy for the purpose of efficiency was important for Weber. At the same time, this created impersonality and a distance between followers and leaders. So this was really about managing workers and followers from a distance. And as you can imagine, Max Weber had a real change of heart after positing the bureaucracy and describing what a bureaucracy could be like, realizing that that impersonality and that distance in a bureaucracy that existed between followers and leaders was really untenable and unworkable, and created all kinds of dire side effects, like a real lack of creativity, a real lack of input from workers, and a real lack of investment in terms of the process for workers and for followers in their organization. So now we drop into the 20th century, early 20th century, and Frederick Taylor. Boo! If you think about EDU 210 at the beginning of that class, I had you look a little bit at Frederick Taylor's theory of efficiency and how organizations can work. So basically his notion was to utilize and enforce the hierarchy for the purpose of efficiency. And of course, as much as we think about schools as being loosely coupled kinds of organizations, maybe matrix driven, and maybe, as we'll see in a moment, they're more like K-ords in terms of the organizational dynamics that are going on, and in how the outcomes are developed and modeled and evaluated, standardized tests. Frederick Taylor has really had his day, as well as having bells between classes, for example, that move people in an efficient way and structuring everybody in rows. So really, Frederick Taylor is the antithesis of Marx, because his purpose was in efficiency. Workers have no say in this particular model. And as I mentioned, his particular influence and the influence on schools was significant in developing standardized tests and standardized processes throughout systems. So now we arrive at the 20th century and 21st century for more recent theories of organizational development and organizational life in the work of someone like Margaret Wheatley. So these ideas really infuse the current kind of entrepreneurial spirit, particularly what's existing in the United States, the development of startups and the organization and the development of organizations that are much more agile and flexible and responsive to outside influences and the effects of change. Next, we have chaotic organizations, which are organizations that have a number of nodes and centers of activity that are constantly organizing and reorganizing, and in the process organizing and reorganizing the organization based on goals always, and that mission, vision, and values that we talked about earlier. So in some sense, schools are like this, even though there's an overall structure that kind of keeps those different nodes and pieces of the organization pinned down. But chaotic organizations do exist and can exist. In earlier iterations of this particular course, I used to have students, when we were face-to-face, step outside of the classroom and go on to the lawn of the Lucina and organize themselves according to the following process. Each person had to pick out two people that they needed to stay equidistant from, and they needed to move around as those people moved around to try to keep themselves equidistant from one another. If you looked at something like that from above, and that particular pattern and that structure, you could see that there was an organizational pattern that was taking place. On the ground, however, it looked a little bit chaotic. I actually did have one class that organized and reorganized itself over the course of about 5 minutes, to the point where everybody was walking in exactly the same direction, equidistant from one another. So chaotic organizations can be very successful. So these organizations do exist, and they can be very successful because they can respond to outside influences and change and outside threats at these particular nodes that have been shaped, so they don't affect the organization at large quite as much. So now we arrive at the granddaddy of organizational psychology, and that's Ed Schein, whose contribution to thinking about culture you're going to be reading about and discussing and describing this week. So organizational culture is really about shared assumptions that have been developed over time through history and experiences in the organization. They're really kind of about the DNA of what the organization is. And this notion of culture is really vital to know as leaders because it can contribute to your understanding as leaders of how the organization functions, how teams function, and how organizations follow their mission, visions, and values in order to achieve some sense of success. So the bottom line for leaders is really to observe and understand the cultures in which you're functioning and in which leaders functioning. And this is really kind of a bottom line because being aware of the kinds of cultures, the assumptions, the norms, how different teams function, how individuals function, what the story is of the organization's recent history, as well as their more distant past, can really affect how we lead. It certainly affects how the organization works and how team members and members of the organization relate to one another, operate together, how they follow leadership, and how they see themselves as followers. So the culture of an organization is a living organism. It changes. There's a dynamic interplay between leaders and followers in an organization. So there's that kind of dynamism, for example, that Karl Marx described long ago. And this is, except for bureaucracies, how organizations run. So cultures are dynamic. Ideas change, interrelationships change, and there's a give and take between leaders and followers. So organizations, teams have a DNA. They've got a memory of who they were in the organization or what the organization was like, past and present. You can often tell walking into an environment what working like there could be like. The culture takes over, and it also affects an individual's assumptions about how the organization runs and how that individual is supposed to relate to the organization, where the authority is, where the responsibilities are, and whether or not the organization is living up to the mission, vision, and values that it states. Part of what organizational culture provides for members is it makes members feel safe. So the purpose of culture, in large part, actually two things. Purpose of culture is safety. Purpose of culture is developing meaning. But safety is very important. You want to know how to function, and you want the world to be predictable. So I, as a member of that organization, know what to expect. The downsides, of course, are that this can lessen a responsiveness to change because we want to stay safe. We don't want to take risks. We don't want to venture out onto a limb. And therefore, our response to change and sometimes our gaps in the performance of the system can also be very telling. So safety has this downside that kind of keeps the organization from growing, keeps integration from happening sometimes, and can often keep the organization from responding to gaps in performance that might be evident. So recognizing that meaning and safety are the reasons why culture exists, we can imagine the fact that particularly with safety and trying to make meaning out of change, change can appear as a threat and creates anxiety and resistance in the members of the organization. So looking at the parts of an organization, which you're going to do in your organizational analysis, can give you some sense of the health of the organization. Not only how well the organization creates safety and meaning for its members, but also how it responds to outside threats and outside changes, as well as changes within in terms of integration of various members and teams. In your organizational analysis and in your final project, you're going to be looking largely at what exists below the surface in your school and below the surface in the teams that you work in that school. So you're going to uncover what exists below the surface and take a look at some of the ways that those parts of the organization align or misalign with some central ideas like the mission, vision, and values of the school. In your organizational analysis and through your work, you're going to be looking at different levels of culture. So you're going to be looking at artifacts, meeting minutes, websites, brochures, what kinds of outward-facing and inward-facing pieces of information can you find that describe what your school and what your district are like. Then you're going to be looking at espoused values. So mission, vision, and values is an important place to look and an important place to see if there's a developed alignment between that and these other portions of the levels of culture. Most important, what's going on underneath the surface. So what kinds of assumptions are people making? What are some of the norms in the organization? This goes from visible to invisible, and the lowest levels are most important because that's what's really going on in the organization. In your organizational analysis and in your project, you're going to be looking at alignment. So you're going to be seeing whether or not the school, whether or not the district aligns with the ideas and the kinds of mission, vision, and values that school and that district have created. Aligning with the mission, aligning with the vision is extremely important because you want everybody working toward the same goal, and sometimes mismatches and misalignments can really create a problem. So that's what you're going to be analyzing, particularly at the classroom level, and how different literacy strategies, different literacy programs are aligned or misaligned and can affect student achievement because they're not necessarily aligned all the way through the organization. So you're going to take a look at that and you're going to analyze that in your paper. So a healthy organization is one that's aligned, one where you can see the through line between what the organization espouses and what it's actually delivering and providing to its clients, its students in this particular case, as well as its teachers who are employees, and followers on the ground. So you're going to look at that alignment and you're going to describe how healthy the school and the district is in which you work. Health means that the school has a sense of identity, that it has the capacity to cope with threat and change, both outside and inside, and it can respond to those threats. And finally, the ability to learn and move forward, receiving that feedback loop and changing its operations as a result, if need be. There are many ways to look at organizations, and I've provided you with a few of those. And in fact, if you think back about some of those theorists that we covered and some of the ideas in this PowerPoint, you'll see that we're influenced by these ideas in our organizations and our daily work. So understanding organizations, particularly as leaders, can be really vital, and knowing where your influence can have the greatest impact in an organization, recognizing its culture and recognizing how to operate within it. So I look forward to some of the emergent ideas that you're going to provide about your organizations and the way in which you view their culture.